This is Mae Brussell. It is tape number 861, June the 6th, 1988. Before I get into the material, I want to say that I decided to discontinue making the weekly tapes. It's been 17 years, one tape a week for that length of time. Now I want to start writing books and travel and read a lot of the books that I have here and clear out a lot of the articles that are in boxes around the house. And mostly I want to also, besides going through the books and articles, begin writing some material myself. So through July up till number 868, and that will be the last tape cassette that I'll get out in the format that we've had all of these years. So don't plan beyond that and don't send in checks beyond that. There are a lot of important deaths to update here that I have been getting behind because there's so much news that floods the desk, and all of you have the same problem keeping up with all of this news. But there's one that is significant about America and says a lot about America, and I can't pass this one up. And this has to do with the death of the airman, the recruit Lee Mareki, 19 years old from Wisconsin, who died in the Navy. Maybe I'm sure all of you read one article or so, in the Navy training, life-saving instruction course that he was taking. And the thing about this story is that, of course, the family were told that he died of natural causes. We have our apparent heart attacks, we have the natural causes, and then they began to get some anonymous letters or letters telling them to look into it, and they began to challenge the federal government, the authorities in the Navy about what was going on. And as a matter of fact, this case could possibly, according to the attorney of the family, could possibly challenge the traditional law that the federal government can't be sued for the death of military personnel in the line of duty. The family members say that they originally were told that their son's death was an accident, and 2 months later, 5 instructors from the Navy Rescue Swimming School were charged with involuntary manslaughter and conspiracy to commit battery. And the important thing about this story, the doubly tragic thing about this story, is that Mirecki was drowned after he left the pool, and he didn't want to go back into the pool. The officers ordered him to go back into the pool against his will, and they pushed his head underwater. And then, while they were doing this, before they put his head under the water, they told the other Navy people around him to turn their backs to the pool so they wouldn't see him drown, and they were to sing the national anthem as loudly as they could to drown out Mirecki's screams. Now, the question here is, what does the national anthem mean? And these fellows turned their back, knowing that one of their classmates, who didn't want to go back into the pool, was screaming and was drowned by the officers or the people over him, and these sailors wanted their subordinates to drown out the sound. Of all the songs, the national anthem was sung while a member of the armed services, who was obviously singled out for some reasons or other, was murdered, absolutely murdered, cold-blooded murder, and they're not being charged with first-degree murder. A Navy rescue instructor yelled, "Get him," as he was being forced back into the pool before a panic-stricken recruit was forced back into the swimming pool, where he died. And these 4 or 5 got him, and he was screaming, "Leave me alone, I quit. I'm quitting the rescue school," and he was exhausted from the other swimming. He was panicking, and Mr. Mirecki was held under the water by the other people, and according to the accounts, he was yelling and screaming. He didn't want to go back. And of course, holding his head under the water and making the others turn their back means that they knew they were going to drown him, because they didn't want the others to see the struggle going where they actually killed this person in the Navy training. There are a lot of inquiries going on. It's been on the news, and a lot of times I don't touch matters that I know you can get from the establishment or other alternative press, but this is one of the most tragic. And one thing that's lacking in the so-called left press, whether it's Nation in these times, Guardian, People's Daily World, is that they write about deaths of third world persons and labor people and so forth. But I think this is significant when this country does this to their own in the Navy school and holds their head underwater and murders them. This is significant because it tells you what life is worth to people in our military, what direction we're going into. And naturally, then the third world and the labor leaders and the Indians and so forth aren't worth anything when the people in the Navy Academy choose to drown a person and play the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem. It's very, very sad, and the circumstances of having those classmates turn their back while they had to sing the national anthem is horrendous. To me, the implications of this particular murder. Now, when Ronald Reagan was in Russia for the summit, starting May 29th, there was an article in the Washington Post by Jeanne Kirkpatrick that was of extreme interest to me, not that I like what she says very much. The title was, "What Questions Did Mike Deaver Not Want Me to Raise?" And the point about this article is that Jeanne Kirkpatrick was saying that Mike Deaver was talking to her in 1983. She said this won't come out in a kiss and tell book, but in 1983 at the Gridiron Dinner, George Shultz had settled in as Secretary of State, and the president's longtime associate, Bill Clark, was National Security Advisor, and I represented the United Nations in New York. And Deaver said in this conversation with Jeanne Kirkpatrick, "I may as well tell you this. You'll have to find out sometime anyway. The president may have an opportunity to make peace for our times, and I think you will have an opportunity to make peace," she repeats it, "for our times." "That would be wonderful," I said. "Everyone notices the influence you have on the president," Deaver said. But he said there are a few people he listens to, and he of course, listened to Michael Deaver a lot. And he said maybe it's because he's really interested in foreign policy that he listens to you. Jeanne Kirkpatrick, he was saying, he listened to her. Maybe it's because he's really interested in foreign policy, and I am too, he interjected. Anyway, Deaver said, when the time comes that the president has the opportunity to make peace, we can't have you and Bill Clark raising questions. We just can't have you and Bill Clark around raising questions, she repeated. Jeanne Kirkpatrick said, I was stunned. Even in retrospect, I find it incredible that this presidential aide, Michael Deaver, with no known role in foreign affairs, had decided that two senior officials, William Clark and herself, Jeanne Kirkpatrick, had to be moved out to prevent them from raising questions. There were rumors circulating in Washington at the time that Deaver was working with Arm & Hammer and that they were trying to change Reagan's views of the Soviet Union and bring around a new expanded détente between the Soviet Union. And, of course, they said the First Lady, according to these rumors, had been enlisted in the project using her best friend Michael Deaver, and reportedly made promises, or someone had, of a favorable press that alluded to a possible Nobel Peace Prize for her husband. Now, what is interesting about this article is that William Clark really had no more knowledge of foreign affairs than Michael Deaver. But at the time the Korean airline went down, and this was in August 83, William Clark was the man in charge of the response to the Korean airline affair. He was the first one that went on, there was quote on the media that saying the people on the KAL weren't killed, that they landed at another island. And later it turned out that this was untrue, that they were just stalling this to get their response back to the Soviet Union. And Bill Clark was working close with Oliver North in writing the responses against, this is the evil empire part coming out, the terrible, terrible Russians. And if you remember Jeanne Kirkpatrick at the United Nations, she was screaming about the KAL. It was embarrassing to be a representative of the United States and hear her talking about the KAL without a piece of evidence yet, blasting them. I'll look up my quotes. I saved all those articles of William Clark and Jeanne Kirkpatrick that they were attacking the Soviet Union. And so was Ronald Reagan at that time. But what happened afterwards, and this is the part that I think is interesting to note, is that the Korean airline, there's a lot of evidence that has been suppressed on the truth of the Korean airline. And I still believe, and many people do, that it was an American spy plane that was sent over to test the responses of the Soviet Union as the plane entered. And, of course, the Soviet Union knows what they did. They know what they were saying. And I think they were pissed off. Of course they were, at the response of America before the facts were in. And those facts are still suppressed today. There's been lawsuits, and those facts are suppressed today. Now, if the Soviet Union caught on to what was really happening, and if they wanted to tone down Ronald Reagan to prepare for anything like a 1988 4 to 5 summits with the Soviet Union, Reagan couldn't change overnight his rhetoric or his policy. But if they wanted to get a Reagan right away and say, now, come on, we've had enough. The first two people he had to unload were William Clark and Jeanne Kirkpatrick. And he did unload them, and they haven't been heard of since. And if Russia was evil, and if Russia did what they said they did to the Korean airline, William Clark and Jeanne Kirkpatrick would still be part of the administration and have all the glory that they wanted, and even she wanted to be head of the National Security Council. Now, in lieu of that, a new article has come out in the Washington Post, and this article is April 16th, 1988, last month, and this article supports, I believe, and goes along with the similar article, not similar, but the story I wrote on the Korean airline that was in Hustler magazine in February 1988, where I said pilot Chun was under mind control, that he was told by his superiors to just keep going. Somebody had told him just keep going in the direction off course. Going off course, he would be assured to be destroyed, but I made note that he had no panic. He didn't show any anxiety. They were warning him that the Russian plane was around, that he was in the wrong direction, and he simply asked for elevation of feet and sailed into the sky, and the ship was blown up, and the ship was meant to be blown up. And, of course, again, Clark and North and Jeanne Kirkpatrick headed the lambasting along with a group of others. Now, in this Washington Post article, the new article, it's based upon new testimony coming out in a lawsuit in Korea. There's still these lawsuits going down in Korea. And remember, about a year ago, there was information pertaining to those lawsuits that the pilot's wife, the first chief pilot, Chung's wife, said that he told her he was not coming back that night, that he was going away and he'd never come home. Sort of like the Manchurian Candidate in reverse, the Americans or the Koreans doing it to him for the purposes of Cold War. And so I want to show this article. It's by Douglas Fever. The pilot of the ill-fated Korean airline 007, shot by the Soviets in 1983, knew he was off course near Soviet territory, but he was afraid he would be disciplined by his airline and lose face if he attempted to correct the error, a colleague has theorized in the court proceedings. Now, the colleague I'm going to talk, this one that they're quoting, is the man who trained Chun. And the idea is that, well, I'm off course, but I'd be embarrassed to turn back when many planes have gone off course and turned back, is still hiding the fact that he knew he was off course and kept going. That's the point I want to stress. The article says the colleague testified that he tried by radio to warn the pilot of 007 something was amiss. The colleague's aircraft, KAL Flight 015, was trailing Flight 007 that night, was right behind him that night. And it was a long time till he could testify in court. The Koreans have stopped him from talking. The shooting down of the KAL was more than 300 miles off course and occurred over Soviet waters September 1st, 1983, killing 269 people. The reason for the monstrous navigational error has never been established because there are no surviving witnesses and an extensive effort to recover the flight's data. Cockpit records have failed. The result has been at least 10 books, a newsletter that continues to this day, a multitude of theories, including Mae Brussell's, including one that the United States used the flight to tickle Soviet radar and reap an electronic intelligence harvest. The theorists will be intrigued, these theorists, with a key new document, a deposition taken in Seoul last September 87, more than 4 years after the drowning, by Captain Park Yong Man, the pilot of the other KAL jetliner, who has been a reluctant witness. Park has long been the target of U.S. liability lawyers. He has declined to testify earlier and suggests in his deposition he was forced by the KAL to retire, then paid full salary to keep his mouth shut about his version of what happened, and now he has it in the court. He said that the court documents have to illustrate his retirement in 1955. The Korean Airlines said that was normal to retire, but he felt it was unusual, and he resented being fired at the time. Most aviation experts believe the crew members of 007 had misprogrammed the plane's inertial navigation system on the onboard computers that guided the plane. This is all three. Many pilots told reporters that appropriate checks by the alert crew, such as any error, would be discovered and corrected. Park's deposition put him squarely in the camp of those experts and adds a possible motive for the 007 crew, headed by Captain Chung Bin-yin, not reacting to an INS error, either by seeking help or attempting to return to Anchorage, where the flight started. And that's exactly what I was writing about. Incidentally, there are new subscribers to these tapes who do not have the article I wrote for Hustler. If you want a reprint of that, send a self-addressed stamped envelope and I'll send it to you. On the state of mind of Captain Chun, and of course this article says he was not reacting to the error, and he was not seeking help, and he did not attempt to return to Anchorage. The INS carried by Flight 007 had three computers. One was coupled to the pilot's autopilot, a second to the co-pilot's autopilot, the third monitors the other two pilots, and if there's any disagreement between the pilots and the co-pilots, the third system alerts the crew, and if all three are in agreement, there is no alert. The INS totally depends upon people for its initial information, people who feed the information into it. They depend upon, including geographic coordinates of where it's supposed to go, and if the coordinates are inaccurately entered into all three systems, the plane could return to the airport where it started the flight with the computers to be reset. A fully loaded 747 carries 350,000 gallons of fuel. They would have to dump it into the ocean. It may cost $19,000. The cost is about that much. And the explanation of the person writing this article, or the friend of Chung's that went down, is the possibility that it might have irritated passengers to go back to Anchorage, or the airline officials if you wasted the gasoline. Now, which is more expensive, taking them back? Since when do passengers have the say of their own safety? Did they take a vote of the 269 and say, are you willing to just keep going? We're off course. Or knowing they were off course, because this pilot trained Chung and was telling him at the time what was happening. The passengers could hardly be irritated, including Representative Larry McDonald, if he knew he had a choice to go alive to Anchorage or dead over the Soviet Union. Dead passengers can't be irritated. What does this mean? And airline officials could replace the fuel. Which is cheaper, $19,000 worth of fuel or a new KAL, or all the lawsuits against KAL and Boeing and the payments for covering up what happened? Those are the two most feeble things I've read in a long, long time. This article continues, quoting the man who trained Chun. I would say a host of factors were involved in this case, Park was saying in his deposition. Number one was Chun's credibility was at stake. Number two, the prestige and dignity. And three, that Captain Chung was picked as a prestige pilot, so there again, he must have been taken into consideration what we call face. Now, again, this is the mind control of the man. His credibility is at stake. If the system was set wrong when they left Anchorage, the INS system, why is he saving face? His credibility isn't at stake if it's set wrong. Is his prestige and dignity, does he have to be suicidal because he's told his prestige and dignity is gone? Well, I believe he was under mind control and continued until that blew up, because the political implications of the KAL going down were tremendous. And not only did we get rid of late Representative Larry McDonald, but he was chairman of Western Goals, and Western Goals then went into the hands of Carl Spitz Channel, the close associate of Ollie North and Betsy North's father's on the board of Western Goals. John Singlom's on the board of Western Goals, and it was their organization that was putting information into Washington from computers in the police department. And the whole point is that Western Goals remained protected after all of this. Carl Spitz Channel pleaded guilty with the Iran-Contra affair a year and a half almost, at least a year, and there's not even a word about his sentencing or anything about that. But poor Chung's credibility would be at stake. If he went back, his prestige would be back, and he was picked as a prestigious pilot. Well, why was he picked for that night? The most prestigious pilot, the pilot of the president of South Korea, with Larry McDonald, the chairman of the John Birch Society, on that airplane. Most of you know, some of you don't, that when John Birch, who worked for United States intelligence, was killed in China after the war, the Birch Society began their organizations and said their branches and their main organization saying this was the first death of World War III. So the man who the John Birch Society was named after was killed in Asia, and now you have the chairman of the John Birch Society. He was picked as a prestige pilot, so as a prestige pilot, you don't try to save the lives of the people on the plane. I'm going at great length into this story because it's so important into the effect it had, and then also, according to Deaver now, when this was over and all the brahu was over, William Clark and Jeanne Kirkpatrick were shelved, and Reagan then, and maybe Nancy with her outside contacts, who were astrologers but also advisors, stopped that craziness against Russia. Russia said, stop that craziness against us, and then the wheels started turning as early as the fall of 1983 to stop the anti-Soviet line and start the summits. Now, one of the people that moved from working for Senator Henry Jackson, he was in Washington on the board of Boeing, the plane that went down. He died the day after KAL went down, and his assistant, Richard Pearl, moved up into the Defense Department after the KAL for this violent anti-Soviet rhetoric. But you see, Richard Pearl was shelved when the president went to Russia, and there were so many political implications of this event. But this article certainly illustrates, and there's a little bit more, the mind of the pilot, and for me confirms a lot of what I knew happened in the point of sacrificing Larry McDonald, the head of the Birch Society, the chairman of Western Goals, starting off this Cold War rhetoric almost to the battle point. Some people wanted to go to war, and now this testimony is coming out about the mind of the pilot. And what I had in my article for Hustler was that Chun was under mind control and had no free will to go the direction he did, in which case Russia had no choice but to shoot the plane down. Now, this article continues in the Washington Post. Captain Chun must have been afraid of being put to sanction or punishment if he dumped the fuel in the ocean. This is Park saying this again. Isn't that silly? To dump $18,000 worth of fuel is punishment when you know you're going to be killed. He testified that he was aware of incidents prior to the KAL where KAL pilots had encountered navigational problems, dumped the fuel and returned, and had been disciplined. But discipline is different than being dead. KAL in court documents confirms navigational errors of at least 3 other INS-equipped KAL jets prior to the tragedy that happened the end of 1983, August 83. However, KAL said no pilot was ever fired as a result of fuel dumping incidents. Some were disciplined and some were not. Park was forced to retire from the KAL shortly before he and other employees were to be deposed in the United States on the civil litigation of the KAL. And this September in Korea, he declined to testify earlier but decided I had to do it because otherwise I would have to lie, and I didn't want to do it. In an errata sheet filed with the court in December of last year, Park wrote, I understood that I was being asked to assist the Korean Airlines in evading and hiding the truth from the United States court. That's why he wouldn't come to the United States, even though no one expressly told me to lie. And that's when Chung's wife said that her husband said he wasn't coming home. The civil litigation here in Washington was brought by relatives of those killed on the KAL. The defendants were the KAL, Boeing, and Litton Industry that made the INS system. All but the KAL had been dismissed as defendants by Chief District Court Judge Aubrey Robinson, Jr. in Washington, D.C. In one document, the KAL attorney said in Park's deposition resulted in absolutely no factual testimony, which would probably serve as a basis for a trial for whether the KAL was guilty of willful misconduct in the shooting down. He couldn't provide that. Under civil law that applies to international flights, plaintiffs have to prove willful misconduct on the part of a defendant, or they are limited to a maximum of $75,000 apiece in damages. Captain Park at one time was Captain Chun's commander in the South Korean Air Force. On the night of the KAL shooting, Captain Park and Captain Chun made refueling stops together at Anchorage. On the way to Seoul, Flight 007, piloted by Chun, left 14 minutes before Park's flight 015, piloted by Park. Both flights were scheduled to take the same North Pacific route, known as R-20. Aviation charts for the route clearly states that planes straying from it into the Soviet airspace may be fired on without warning. Early in the flight, according to radar data, Flight 007 began to stray off course. It was still within what is considered normal limits. When it flew beyond the range of civilian air radar, they couldn't keep it up. On long overwater flights, there is no civilian radar monitoring, making accurate cockpit navigation essential. But pilots do check in with air traffic controllers by radio when they pass regular checkpoints. Several times that night, Flight 015, right behind Chung's, relayed the routine reports between 007 and the air traffic controllers, where the controllers were unable to get normal communications. As a result, Park testified he became worried. I myself and my co-pilot as well thought that something unusual was happening. He radioed 007 and was told by Chun that Chun was encountering strong winds. Park told Chun that wasn't the situation with Flight 015, that they weren't having strong winds, which was supposedly flying the same route. Park testified he intended his communications to serve as a warning to Captain Chung that something was wrong. And he could have also, Chung was 300 miles off course, but the black box is not available, and that is the latest in the KAL story, which I want to update because the article I wrote, I believe, is a solid article based upon a lot of material that I put together at the time, and as new things come out, I like to hold them against what I wrote, and Chung is complaining about weather and nothing else. Now, what else were they talking about? The guy who trained him must say, Chung, you're off course. You don't say, I'm going up 30,000 feet, or it's windy here, and the other guy says, no, it's not windy where I am. That's not what you talk about if you're on course checking in, or you're not checking in, or you say get back, or you're going to get your ship blown up. It was stated quite clearly it would be blown up if it was in that direction. So there was communication with the man who trained this pilot. This pilot was formerly the pilot for the president of South Korea. He was on a prestigious route. He couldn't go back, couldn't save face, okay? And what happened was he continued until the Soviets forced him down by shooting him down, and by shooting him down, they got Larry McDonald, the head of Western Goals and the John Birch Society, and started the Cold War rhetoric that was so massive that I'm sure that Nancy and the Soviet Union got together with Ronnie and said, cool it. And the middle man between that would be Michael Deaver, who waits until 1988 to tell Jeanne Kirkpatrick that William Clark, this was Ronald Reagan's closest friend from California. He made him a justice on the Supreme Court. Clark was the guy who brought Helene von Damme into this country, was part of the operation of bringing her to this country. He was he left the NSC into silence. Jeanne Kirkpatrick is, for all purposes, obscured for the column, except the column she writes, and the president made 4 trips to the Soviet Union after all these things took place. We'll take about a 30-second break, turn this tape over, and then I'll continue with some more on the summit, the election, and the news surrounding those 2 events. This is Mae Brussell. It is the second side of tape 861. June the 6th, 1988. There's a long article in the San Francisco Chronicle, June 1st, 1988, titled Behind the Long Resume, The Life of George Bush. And it goes into his home, his family, his life in Texas, his war record, CIA director. And the article states it is a constant source of astonishment, as well as anger to his friends and family, that this genuine war hero is sometimes dismissed as a wimp, an unworthy successor to the virile Ronald Reagan, who spent the last war, on a Hollywood backlot making training films. Well, the title wimp came to George Bush from the very far right, from Jack Kemp and Jeanne Kirkpatrick and Newt Gingrich and Richard Vagary. It came, that original wimpish title came to him because he could not take on, with his speechwriters or his big mouth, the rhetoric that Ronald Reagan had all of his life, or Richard Nixon had against the communists. If you're not talking anti-communism all the time, you're a wimp. You can behave like an anti-communist and do a lot of the dirty dealing, which he's done all of his life. But the title came from the very people that are now pushing him for president, but have always been suspicious of him being a wimp compared to Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. Then the article continues, Bush returned from the war to take his economics degree from Yale University, graduating Phi Beta Kappa in 1948 after serving as captain of the baseball team and being sworn into the secretive, prestigious Skull and Bones Society. Now, the article doesn't say, we know it's a secretive society. I'm not sure how prestigious it is. Yeah, it's prestigious enough. But they don't tell how he got nude inside of a coffin for his initiation, or dug up the skull of a famous person to put it in away from the cemetery into the basement at Yale. Why don't they tell a little more about George Bush? Just throwing it out now, so the prestigious Skull and Bones, you'd think it was something like the Phi Beta Kappa, which it isn't. Every year, 15 graduates are selected from Skull and Crossbones, and George Bush was one of them. Now, Ronald Reagan went to Soviet Union, and it got so much coverage. I only want to bring up a few points that you might have seen in the news, but I do want to share with you. And one was he went to see the Refuseniks and invited a former member of the Gestapo. The Gestapo doesn't have former members any more than the CIA. The Waffen SS had a 1,000-year pledge, so when the 1,000 years over, he's a former member of the Gestapo. But the man's name is Nikolai Rozhko, R-O-Z-H-K-O, and he lives in the Byelorussia section of Russia, where the worst atrocities took place, killing the Russian population. And, of course, there have been books on the Byelorussia secret and stories of the atrocities of that area. And he was responsible for a lot of the Nazi occupation atrocities at that time. It turns out that this Rozhko was originally born in the United States, went to the Soviet Union as a child, joined the Waffen SS, and was very active as a member of the Waffen SS. And he's one of the Refuseniks who wants to come to this country, come back to the United States because he was born here. And actually, he was sentenced to death by the military tribunal. In 1944, his sentence was commuted to 20 years imprisonment. He was released in 1955, and it would be a tragedy to bring that man to the United States. That's the hero that Ronald Reagan wants to bring to the United States. You can imagine what all the others were if you pick that up. Then the president gave a speech to Mikhail Gorbachev, and he referred to a movie, Friendly Persuasion, and he brought him a copy of the film for him to see at whatever time he wanted. And he didn't mention to Mr. Gorbachev that the man who wrote Friendly Persuasion, his name is Michael Wilson. He was the author of the screenplay. He was blacklisted in Hollywood by Ronald Reagan and his gang out here in Hollywood, and Senator Joe McCarthy group at Reagan was active in the participation of the blacklisting people. He goes there and brings a movie written by Michael Wilson and doesn't tell Gorbachev that this man was accused of being a communist. He refused to speak before the House on American activities, and in fact, the film that he gave doesn't even have the name of Michael Wilson on it. He wasn't allowed to use his name because of the terror in Hollywood and the book publishers and so forth. And he's bragging about the movie that was made here. in Hollywood, and he also is talking the theme of civil war and the hard choices you have to make. And what Ronald Reagan was telling the Russians, very not too subtly, was egging them on to have a civil war to get your freedom of your press and religion, and eventually we will have enough CIA money to have these dissidents in all the areas of Russia kicking up and kicking ass. And of course, Ronald Reagan is instigating, as he has done for many years, this inside war inside Russia to overthrow that regime. The gift that he took to Gorbachev, the main gift, was a bronze statue of an American cowboy with a rattlesnake in bronze. I don't have to comment. I think you get the meaning of that. And while the American Indians are over there protesting the fact that they've been dislocated, that the American Indian movement is not in their behalf, that they've been mistreated, he's telling the people in Russia that a lot of them sit on a hunk of oil. He doesn't talk about the uranium or plutonium that's under the Aryan flag near Flagstaff, where the Navajos and the Hopis have been displaced, and how the coal companies and the mineral sources are waiting to kill off and move the Indians to utilize all of that. He referred to a few Indians sitting on oil, and the Indians are over there protecting American policies in our country, and he's taking a statue of a cowboy. And what Reagan thinks about when he sees a cowboy is killing the Indians. If you don't know that, just read all the books and movies on the cowboy and Indians, and a bronze rattlesnake. Hardly a dove or an image of peace, but a rattlesnake and a cowboy, and a movie called Friendly Persuasion about Civil War. Then Reagan went to meet the artists and writers and movie directors and professors, theater managers in the Soviet Union on Tuesday, and there's an article in the LA Times of this dazzling affair. He referred in one of the speeches in Finland to Albert Camus, the writer. They must have been laughing by the time he got over to the Soviet Union. That was a day earlier. And then in one speech, he had quotations from Serge Eisenstein, the director, from a poet, Anna Amatov, another Russian poet, Gumilev, American novelist, William Faulkner, and 2 or 3 other Russians. And he was praising the necessity to keep your culture alive, to have free speech, that out of these arts comes understanding. And I'm just paraphrasing the crappy speech he gave. They were all reprinted in the New York Times, but this is what he was telling them. Well, he was just talking about Faulkner, and I recently, just this month, bought a book that came out from research, Tom Davis, called Dangerous Dossiers by Herbert Mitgang. I mentioned it briefly on other broadcasts. And, incidentally, mentioning research and Tom Davis, I'm going to put on the program or type up a sheet of the books that I've gotten recently. There's so many good books, it's hard to update them on the broadcast. But this book is about the FBI keeping dossiers and how hard it was for these people to get jobs, and that the FBI was discrediting Ernest Hemingway because Hemingway called the FBI an American Gestapo. I don't know that Hemingway knew at the time that J. Gruber was vice president of Interpol, that was headed by Heydrich and the father of the Final Solution, and Heinrich Himmler and the Nazi police, when he referred to a Gestapo. But in the subject of people being followed and discredited and kept from their career, and the contents includes Thomas Wolfe, Dorothy Parker, John O'Hara, Nelson Algren, Dashiell Hammett, Irwin Shaw, Truman Capote, A.J. Liebling, Thornton Wilder, Robert Sherwood, Elmer Rice, Maxwell Anderson, William Saroyan, Lillian Hellman, Tennessee Williams, Archibald MacLeish. These are enemies of the FBI. Robert Lowell, Robert Frost, W.H. Auden, H.L. Mencken, Edmund Wilson, Stephen Spender, Graham Greene, and Hannah Arendt, Aldous Huxley, Ignazio Silone. Huxley died a very quiet death the same day that John Kennedy was assassinated, and I believed that they could do him in at that time and not have to worry about it. Also on his list was a Mr. Faulkner, the one that he's quoting here as being a source of inspiration, and you have to have freedom. And the FBI and the CIA both waged wars against people like Hemingway, Steinbeck, and Faulkner. Isn't that ironic that he's in Russia talking about Faulkner? I'd like to write a letter to the Soviet embassy and send them a copy of this book. What funny speeches he gives, meeting member of the Waffen SS, and maybe there were 2 or 3 more, and not telling him how our CIA and our FBI went against Allen Ginsberg, Norman Mailer, William Malden, John Kenneth Galbraith, etc., Alexander Calder, Ben Shahn, George O'Keefe, Henry Moore. Those are some of the people in this marvelous book, Dangerous Dossiers, by Herbert Mitgang, it just came out, and Tom has it at Research. You can get other places, but support his effort to get these books. And here's our president talking about an example of an American writer that people should emulate and have freedom in the Soviet Union, and it's that person that is harassed by the FBI and CIA in this country, and he's telling about friendly persuasion and civil wars and taking a rattlesnake and a cowboy when American Indians are over there telling him our plight. So enough about that summit. I think you get the point of what I think about that whole thing, which I can say on a tape. It's not on the air, is a crock of shit that was formed. It had some purposes, but the Soviet Union, I believe, dragged Reagan over to these peace talks earlier. I did broadcast on the belief that the quick Reykjavik summit was because of Danilov's possible involvement in the blowing up of the Chernobyl, knowing people there in the Chernobyl disaster that has never been explored. And another man who's gone into literal obscurity is Mr. Danilov. While the president was at the Danilov Chapel, I don't think if any of you saw his name in all those days, and if there was media coverage, every single station and everyone was there, and as news people and interviewed, and I didn't see hide nor hair of Danilov, good riddance, or Jeanne Kirkpatrick or William Clark, thank goodness. And I believe that I have to believe that the KGB intelligence is as smart as Mae Brussell. If Mae can figure some of these things out, they can, and they can say, come to Reykjavik, and Nancy was kept home, and Reza Gorbachev was saying how romantic it was to being on a boat with her husband and rubbing it in, and I think that the necessity to talk at this time has as much to do with possible blackmail of the last 8 years as anything there is going. Now, I'm not going to do too much on the individual people running in this election. It'll be Dukakis and Bush after tomorrow, and I'll do more. But there's little things coming out now, and Bush warned he would do them, and the CIA, of course, was the agency that he was the director of. And now there are stories coming out such as the following. Washington Post, May 28th, 1988, by T.R. Reid. Dukakis is called a pagan for his views and for having a Jewish wife. A Senate Republican leader aide, a conservative Republican group, are now circulating an open letter saying that Dukakis is no friend of the Christians. He is a pagan. He uses his membership in the Greek Orthodox Church as a convenient prop for political purposes. The letter, distributed widely in the conservative and Greek American communities, was put out and publicized in the conservative weekly Human Events, and you know that group. It was put at Human Events, and by columnists Evans and Novak, you know that team. They say Dukakis is an imposter who attacks our church. Now, this is very significant, the part of Greek Orthodox Church and Dukakis, because the Roman Church, I'll interject this article and go into 1 second, get back to it. The Roman Church believes that the headquarters of the Roman Empire and the source of God and Jesus is in Rome. And the Greek Orthodox Church, that is now 1,000 years old, believes that the center is in the Soviet Union. And I believe I've done broadcasts and mentioned before on radio programs that the real fight, one of the real fights that is never disclosed openly or delved into in any scholarly manner, is that one of the reasons the Roman Empire has had this diatribe against Russia, even when it was under the Tsar, the wars against Russia and Great Britain and Japan goading Russia in 1905 and in 1914 and again now continuously, is that for once and for all, the Roman Church wants to wipe out the Greek Orthodox Church. If they took Russia, if we had a war and won Russia, there would be only one head of the Roman Church, and that would be in the Vatican, St. Peter's grave, and the Vatican in Rome, Italy. And they do not like the attention of the Greek Orthodox Church. So the great warmongers, Robert Novak and Roland Evans and Robert Novak and the magazine Human Events, and the Catholics, or the people close to the war machinery, are attacking Dukakis for his links to those inside the Greek church, which is really interesting because if he's not one of the Catholics under John Paul II, then he is a pagan. The article says that Dukakis is an imposter, as I said before, who attacks our church. He attacks Christ. As evidence, the letter notes that Dukakis had opposition to aid for the Nicaraguan Contras. This is actually in the Washington Post. Can you believe it? As evidence that he's a pagan. He opposed aid to the Contras. He is pro-choice on abortion, and he's married to a non-Christian, not only a non-Christian, but Kitty is Jewish. He's a pagan because he opposes aid to the Contras. The 10-page report was written by James Jatras, J-A-T-R-A-S, and I'd love to get a hold of the 10-page report. He works for Senator William Armstrong, the Republican for Colorado. Now, I could do a whole program or two on Colorado, but we'll continue. Armstrong is on the Senate Republican Policy Committee. Jatras said he distributed hundreds of these letters of the letter of the Greek Orthodox prelates and the leaders of the Greek American community. And there's an ad hoc committee, the Defense Committee in Defense of Life, based on the anti-abortion group and so forth. A key figure in the ad hoc committee against Dukakis is Joseph Sobran, a conservative columnist who has been accused by Jews of being anti-Semitic. Armstrong said through his spokesman that he is familiar with Jatras' letter. This is a Republican from Colorado, and this is his aide. He decided to write the letter as a private citizen. You've heard this before. The attack on Dukakis drew criticism from other Republicans, such as Frank Fahrenkopf, who said, "We do not believe that religion should be the basis for political attack. Dukakis is a pagan, and his wife is Jewish." And Jatras said in an interview, he tried to point out that Michael Dukakis falsely portrays himself as a member even of the Greek Orthodox Church. He is the son of a Greek immigrant in the U.S. Greek community. There are many types of Greeks. Among the Americans of Greek descent, there is a minority who would support Satan himself if his name ended in A-K-I-S. Among them, they would support Satan himself if it ended with A-K-I-S. And he is saying that he is, because he's married to a non-Christian, and although he was baptized in the Greek Orthodox Church, he's still a pagan, and this is going out. The letter called Dukakis' decision to marry a Jew a rebellion against his own church. And Jatras criticized Dukakis because he has not baptized his own children in the church, having married a Jewish woman. So that's a little part of the uglier side of what's going on in the campaigns. It reminds me of the prodigals of Elders of Zion. The surgery for Dukakis' wife is, we'll just assume that that is what they said it was, that she had this trouble with the discs in her back, and write that off as a disconcerting event that will keep her from campaigning with him, where wives, along with their husbands, make a good appearance, and she was diagnosed as having a herniated disc. It's just a coincidence, nothing else. We chalk these up to coincidence. Just add them up, and when Gerald Ford was, just the time he was appointed president by crook Richard Nixon, I always refer to that transfer of powers, the crook giving it to Ford of the Warren Commission. Betty Ford went into the hospital. She was told immediately she had cancer of the breast and went into the hospital, and shortly after those events she started to require drugs for pain, and the rest you know what happened to her. And when Nelson Rockefeller was made vice president, very quickly, Happy Rockefeller was sent in and had her breast removed and was told she had cancer. Women who have weekly or yearly checkups and pretty good medical care that they can afford are in some way mutilated and removed from the scene as these men move into power. And if I wanted to be very much a conspiracy theorist, I would say this would be a good chance to have the men alone while the women are out of the way, to set down the ground rules and get it firmly into their crazy heads before the little lady comes around and changes these matters and can influence them. As a matter of fact, Reagan was only president for 60 days, inaugurated on the 21st of January, and shot the 30th of march, and Nancy stayed close to him. They didn't remove her from the scene. If she had been sick then, later she did have a cancer operation and also had a breast removed. There seems to be a certain type of inconvenience in mingling among these people, but again, that's all, that's what you call a conspiracy theorist. That isn't hard work, that's just a little thought I'm sharing with you. Now, Gore Vidal wrote a article for Interview magazine, and it was quoted in the Chronicle June the 2nd, 1988, and they just had a two-sentence quote from Interview, and I want to share with you what Gore Vidal said, because, of course, he studies American politics very closely, even though he lives in Italy now, and it is apropos of elections in 1988 and why I don't take it too seriously. Who wins the primaries in California tomorrow? I'll vote, but I really couldn't care less because it all waters down to the same people advising the same whoever wins. I've said that before. I care about some things like the choices of the justices of the Supreme Court, so I vote Democratic. But the elections are a complete fraud, and they have been since the last election in 1960, when John Kennedy's head was blown off. Now, this is what Gore Vidal said, and this is very much like the very first published article on Watergate that I wrote in 1972. There are two governments. There is the National Security Government, which was put in place by the National Security Act of 1947. That is the real government of our country. Then there is the Cosmetic Government, the government for show, the ongoing presidential government and Congress, which is totally meaningless now. And if ever it was meaningless, was after the Iran-Contra affair, when the powers that be called in John Tower and Mr. Scowcroft from Kissinger Associates and Edmund Muskie, there's a wimp if I ever saw one, and they covered up in the Tower report, named after the man who helped bring Marina Oswald into this country, accompanying Lee. The Tower report says there's nothing wrong with the National Security Council. A few people went astray, and even now, it seems that maybe all these cases are going to be thrown out. Nothing is moving, and certainly the use of the NSC and not the individuals who are elected to advise the president won't come up in any way, shape, or form, even if there is a prosecution. This past week there has been a series of movies on Robert Kennedy, on his assassination, exposés of the assassination, the family get-togethers, and today they had a mass on the anniversary of his murder in Washington, D.C. And on one of the segments of the television series titled Who Really Killed Robert Kennedy, the writer Dan Moldea, M-O-L-D-E-A, was interviewed at great length. Moldea wrote the book The Hoffa Wars. He wrote other books. That came out in 1978. Now, it turns out Moldea has been spent a lot of time with Thane Cesar, the security guard who's been named on the television shows as possibly having pulled the second gun and possibly having killed Robert Kennedy. Thane Cesar, they didn't mention what came from Lockheed. The TV show said he was a security guard. Lockheed, of course, is part of the CIA program. It's heavily part of the Defense Department and CIA, which is different than just being a private security guard. And Moldea said, yes, Thane Cesar pulled a gun from behind Robert Kennedy at the Vassar Hotel. And he said, now, Cesar never had any experience like in Vietnam. He's never been in war or battle. So it could have been that Cesar pulled the gun from his holster and put out the shots that caused Robert Kennedy to die. This is Moldea saying this. But then there's no proof that he wanted to kill Robert Kennedy. Now, Luke McKissick, the attorney for Sirhan Sirhan, one of the many ones, stated publicly, and I've had this on before, that if there were two guns and one killed Robert Kennedy, this was a coincidence. They didn't know each other. And, of course, when the House Select Committee finished their work on the Kennedy assassination, they concluded that if there was somebody behind the fence or the Dow Tex building or in the book depository, the second gunman, if there were only two or three, didn't know each other. It was not a conspiracy. It was a coincidence. You know, these stories really stretch your mind and your brains, and maybe this is one of the reasons I'm ready to go off the air and write, just to put down in writing my feelings about some of these people. and their muddled logic, the logic of that Commander Park who trained Chun, the pilot, the logic of Moldea. Now, if Thane Cesar pulled a gun and shot Robert Kennedy from behind, suppose he did that, suppose he's a security guard, well, the police would want to know why a security guard panicked. It would be shocking that he killed the candidate for presidency of the United States, but why did he panic? And so they would have wanted the gun. Other people saw this gun there. Why did the LAPD then destroy the ceiling panels that showed the direction of Caesar's bullets? Why did they cut off the sleeve of Robert Kennedy's coat and throw it away? Why did that happen? Why did they take out parts of the door that would show where extra bullets were? And why did they let Thane Cesar sell his gun and somebody get rid of it and not match it to the bullets that were inside Robert Kennedy or other parts of the room where it went? So if it was simply a coincidence, the greatest coincidence in the world, that a security guard killed the senator, you might say, guard, what are your politics? Oh, you like George Wallace. What do you think of Kennedy? I hate him. How bad do you hate him? Very bad. That's what Thane Cesar said. Hated the Kennedys. Very bad. And he was closely aligned to the very, very far right element that also hated the two Kennedy brothers. So now, if there has to be a second gun, Moldea is saying that forget Thane Cesar because he didn't intend to do it. This is hardly the way to conduct an investigation. And the most disgusting part of this, again, is the family of Robert Kennedy. They listed the children that would be at the services, 10 children that would be at Arlington today. Robert Kennedy Jr., married, father of 2 children, works in environmental law, teaches at Pace University, and doesn't care who killed his father. Courtney Kennedy Rue of New York, married, treasurer of Joe Kennedy's Congressional Committee, and runs the Robert Kennedy Foundation, and doesn't care who murdered her father. Michael Kennedy Jr. of Boston, married, president of Citizens Energy, a nonprofit company, provides low-cost oil for the poor and elderly, went to the Mass, and doesn't care who murdered his father. Kerry Kennedy graduated from Boston College Law School, set up and runs the Kennedy Center for Human Rights in Boston, and could care less who murdered her father. Christopher Kennedy, 24th, works the Merchandise Mart in Chicago and doesn't give a damn who killed his father. Then the one that's named, this is the really great name, one along the line, third from the youngest, 23, Matthew Maxwell Taylor Kennedy, now a senior at Harvard. Isn't that a slap to look into the covert actions and counterintelligence, the kind from Lockheed and the YouTube program that Thane Cesar was a part of? They could say Matthew Kennedy. The others, they don't put the 2 middle names. Maxwell Taylor, the great CIA covert operator. Who would be proud of that name? He certainly was with all the people who knew about who killed, well, Taylor's dead now, but who had killed his father. Douglas Kennedy, 21, a sophomore at Boston College, doesn't care who killed his father. Rory Kennedy, 19, is a sophomore at Brown University. She was born 6 months after her father was killed. Those are 10 children. All good education. All want to be political. All want to save the world. Worried about energy. Worried about keeping the museum going. Worried about human rights. Human rights are going down the drain. We're getting the shaft all across the board. The American citizens, the poor, the blacks, the Indians, the arrogants, and they all assembled to say a prayer, which is their privilege, and not one of them, not a single one of them, with all their education and brain cell, has asked a question. Who killed Daddy? Is he alive? Are they alive? Why did they get away with it? We don't want vengeance, but we want the history straight. And they might ask a few questions about who killed Uncle John. John was killed and they were close. These kids were little, but a lot of them remember him. Not who killed Uncle John and Daddy. It's so obvious. And who put, Uncle Ted in that accident at Chappaquiddick. How these people continue and act like nothing happened is pathetic given their education, etc. This is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week, continuing along with some of these horrendous, I always call them horrendous stories.